World War I was war on a scale never known or imagined before. It was a clash of great empires which destroyed the old and ushered in the new. Dynasties were shattered. How did it ever come to this? A global war of millions, and yet its beginnings seemed just a pinprick. Germany's emergence had reshaped the European map. Germany formed an alliance with the much older empire of Austria-Hungary. Together, these central powers now dominated the heart of Europe. Opposing Germany and Austria-Hungary was the so-called Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. But Europe's complex set of alliances would trigger an unstoppable catastrophe. Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. The Austrian Crown Prince and Princess Sophie are murdered. The assassin is reported to be a member of a terrorist organization backed by the government of neighboring Serbia. Austria mourns and determines to punish the Serbs. Though few realize it, the countdown to war has begun. On the 30th of July, Austrian guns began to bombard the Serbian capital, Belgrade. The Serbs turned to Russia for help. The Germans warned Russia that if it went to war in support of the Serbs, Germany would go to war against the Russians. Provoked by Germany, France now mobilized its troops.
An das deutsche Volk. Alle offenkundige und heimliche Feindschaft von Ost und West, von jenseits der See. Man verlangt, dass wir mit verschränkten Armen zusehen, wie unsere Feinde sich zu tückischem Überfall richten. Es muss denn das Schwert nun entscheiden. Mitten im Frieden überfällt uns der Feind. Darum auf zu den Waffen!
Germany's strategists had concluded that a swift move through Belgium provided the softest route to break into France and capture Paris. The Germans entered the capital, Brussels. As civilians tried to resist, the German army took its revenge, in one instance executing 600 innocent Belgians. At midnight on August the 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. By now, all the great nations of Europe had been sucked into the conflict. As the Germans marched on, Britain was about to fight its first major European war for 99 years. It had begun with the Austrian invasion of Serbia which had triggered the outbreak of war in the first place. It had not been the smooth operation the Austrians had hoped for. Within 6 weeks, the Serbs drove the Austrians out of Serbia. At this time, the other half of Austria's army was also in action. Russian armies surprised everyone by quickly advancing 150 miles into Austria, to the shock of Austrian soldiers. In the face of the Russian onslaught, the Austrians lost 350,000, dead, wounded, or taken prisoner. At the same time, to the north, the Russians were also invading eastern Germany. Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff gathered their forces to resist the Russian advance.
Soldaten der 8. Armee, die vieltägigen heißen Kämpfe auf den weiten Gefilden zwischen Allenstein und Neidenburg sind beendet. Ihr habt einen vernichtenden Sieg über 5 Armeekorps und 3 Kavalleriedivisionen errungen. Mehr als 90.000 Gefangene, ungezählte Geschütze und Maschinengewehre, schwerere Fahnen und viele sonstige Kriegsbeute sind in unseren Händen.
The Germans in turn went on the offensive for a breakthrough in the west. Paris was in their sights. By early September, they were crossing the River Marne, just 30 miles east of the French capital. The French commander-in-chief, General Joffre, unleashed a French and British counterattack. The Battle of the Marne was the turning point of the first year of the war. The German advance was stopped in its tracks. Germany's commanders knew it was a crushing blow. In October 1914, Turkey had joined the war, on Germany's side. The elderly Sultan, Enver Pasha, assumed he'd be part of a quick victory. Enver Pasha sent his forces north to invade Russian Armenia. In the biting winter, the Turks faced a ferocious Russian counterattack. Ypres defined the war on the Western Front for the next 3.5 years. The German army was encamped in French and Belgian territory and facing the Allies along a 475-mile line of trenches. A stalemate, fought from trenches and dominated by death and discomfort. These years will bring an appalling new weapon, poison gas, a new illness, shell shock. On the 25th of April 1915, after a hazardous naval operation, British, French, Australian and New Zealand soldiers landed on the beaches of Gallipoli. The campaign on land degenerated into a bloody stalemate. Finally, in January 1916, the Allies withdrew. They had suffered over 250,000 casualties. The Turks had won a famous victory, but their triumph at Gallipoli would soon be overshadowed by defeat to the north. Russian troops headed through the Caucasus Mountains to attack Turkish Armenia. They captured vital Turkish fortresses, and Turkey would never threaten Russia again. In May 1915, Italy joined the war on the Allied side, tempted by the chance of winning territory from Austria-Hungary, particularly the mountainous Tyrol region. Italian soldiers headed north. Austria diverted troops from the Russian front to reinforce the Tyrol.
Ich war an allen Fronten, bei allen Truppen unserer glorreichsten Armee. Ich sah alle Nationalitäten der weißen Monarchie in vollster Eintracht einem großen Ziele entgegengehen, einem glorreichen Frieden. Bewundernswert sind auch die Helden des Hinterlandes, die stillen Dulder, die durch den Krieg entweder ihr Liebstes verloren haben oder in beständiger Angst und Sorge um ihre Verwandten leben.
For the next 2.5 years, there was stalemate in the mountains. Germany and Austria set their sights on Warsaw, capital of Russian-controlled Poland. The German army strutted through Warsaw. Russian opponents seemed defeated and demoralized. In response to the defeat, Tsar Nicholas II declared himself supreme commander of Russia's armed forces. For those who remained at the front, it was no longer a story of victory, but of retreat. The Germans set their sights on the French fortress town of Verdun. The German bombardment began. Despite the German onslaught, the French resupplied the fortress week after week along a road that became known as the Sacred Way.
Il n'est pas un seul de nos soldats, il n'est pas un seul citoyen, il n'est pas une seule femme de France qui ne comprenne clairement que tout l'avenir de notre race, et non seulement son honneur, mais son existence même, sont suspendus aux lourdes minutes de cette guerre inexorable. Nous avons la volonté de vaincre, nous avons la certitude de vaincre, nous avons confiance dans notre force et en celle de nos alliés, comme nous avons confiance en notre droit.
The Battle of Verdun went on until November. Each side suffered some 350,000 casualties. Of these, around 100,000 from both France and Germany were dead or missing. On May the 31st, 1916, the main German fleet set sail. Within hours, the Germans found themselves facing the entire British Grand Fleet. The main Battle of Jutland began. As in Germany, the British presented the Battle of Jutland as a great naval victory. Admiral John Jellicoe, commander of the Grand Fleet based at Scapa Flow, knew that his losses had been substantially greater than the Germans, both in terms of ships and lives. He did, however, still control the North Sea. The rest of Britain's navy set out to starve Germany by blockading it and stopping its trade with the outside world. General Brusilov carefully prepared to attack the Germans and Austrians across a 200-mile front, taking them by surprise with short, sharp, accurate artillery barrages. His first target was the weaker Austrians. It meant that yet again, the Germans would have to scramble reinforcements in the wake of Austrian defeat. By the winter of 1916, the Germans had gathered the reserves to fight back and regain much of the territory captured in Brusilov's summer offensive. It was a devastating disappointment for ordinary Russian soldiers who'd fought so hard. The Russian soldier had finally had enough. The desperation of the soldiers was spilling over to the civilian population.
We're moving, come on! Let's go!
As Verdun ground on, France looked to her main ally for help. The British intended that the Somme offensive would break clean through the center of the German line and lead to a rapid advance. Some men were told by their officers the artillery bombardment would be so enormous they'd only have to climb out of their trenches and walk through the opposition. "15,000 guns lined up along a 20-mile front.
We'd passed up through, getting into our forward position, we passed through literally miles of guns, all classes and types, to concentrate their barrages on the Germans for our advance. And they were massacred. They made a slight gain, which is all anyone could hope to do at this point, but there was an aimless gain. I mean, you achieved very little.
It was a war where the advantage had constantly shifted, but in the end it was political, not military collapse, which was deciding it. A provisional government took over. Discontent was brewing all over Russia. Strikes became commonplace. People from all sections of society questioned the need for war. The revolution, later glorified in Russian films, was imminent. The Tsar and his family were isolated. During February and March 1917, U-boats succeeded in sinking no fewer than 500 ships. The number of neutral merchant ships arriving in British and Allied ports fell by 3/4. They became the lone hunters, and they gave Germany its one truly effective naval weapon of the war. After the German declaration of unrestricted U-boat warfare, Wilson, emboldened by his electoral mandate, gave Germany a final warning. The Germans took no notice and increased production of U-boats. On April the 6th, the United States finally declared war on Germany. The British welcomed their new allies with open arms. Nivelle believed that an improved combination of continuous artillery bombardment and rapid infantry advance could rupture the German line. But Nivelle's plan was flawed.
Tuer un homme, ça servait à rien, monsieur. Un Allemand qui nous tuait, ça lui servait à rien. Pourquoi? Le front ne bougeait pas, comprenez-vous? Et si vous tiriez sur un homme, pourquoi vous tiriez sur un homme? Mais c'était la peur, mon cher monsieur. Mais c'est pas la patrie qui vous a fait tirer. C'est pour défendre votre peau.
French soldiers began to mutiny. It was simply that the ordinary soldier was no longer willing to go on any more sacrificial advances. The British launched the Third Battle of Ypres, which would lead to Passchendaele. Just 41 square miles were captured in 15 weeks. Each square mile cost some 10,000 casualties. But the British had also taken a huge toll of Germans. For some soldiers, the killing had gone on too long. But there was a twist, a new weapon the Allies had been experimenting with for a year, the tank. Lenin's aim was Bolshevik revolution. But it was his slogan of peace at any price which began to swing support his way.
Что такое советская власть? В чем заключается сущность этой новой власти, которой не хотят или не могут понять еще в большинстве стран? Да прежде государством управляли так или иначе богатые или капиталисты, а теперь первый раз управляют государством. Притом в массовом числе как раз те классы, которых капитализм питал.
In December 1917, an armistice came into force on the Eastern Front. Italy was the first of the Allies to feel the effect of Russia's collapse. In late October, the Austrian and German armies struck in the mountains of northeast Italy. The Italian attempt to capture Austrian territory had turned sour. 275,000 Italian soldiers had been captured by the Germans and Austrians. British and French troops had to be sent in to support. The Italians finally stopped the German advance 15 miles short of Venice. By the end of 1917, the outlook for the Allies was bleak everywhere. (1918). Nearly 4 years of bitter fighting climaxed in a thunderous German attack. The French army was only just recovering from the mutinies of spring 1917. The British army was desperately tired. The German commander on the Western Front, General Erich von Ludendorff, prepared for battle. On March the 21st, 1918, the German army attacked along a 64-mile front. In a fortnight, the German army advanced 20 miles over a 50-mile front, a massive capture of territory compared with the stalemate of the previous 3 years. The biggest transformation of all was the arrival en masse of the Americans, under their commander, General John J. Pershing.
3,000 miles from home, an American army is fighting for you. Only the hardest blows can win against the enemy we are fighting. Invoking the spirit of our forefathers, the Army asks your unflinching support.
By July 1918, a year after they'd first begun to arrive, there were 1 million Americans on the Western Front. Allied confidence was swelled by their new allies. Ludendorff set his sights on Paris, now just 90 miles to the south. If the Germans captured it, victory would be theirs. On May the 26th, the German army renewed its offensive. Their lines were becoming stretched, but their commanders wanted one last push. The French defenses were set well back. When German storm troops arrived, they were out of range of their artillery support. For the Allies, it was the most critical moment of the entire war. Ludendorff knew his gamble had failed. Allied tanks and infantry counterattacked. an American force joined the British and French for a major attack on the German army's key defensive rear position. Then halfway through this year, the Allies strike back. The stalemate of the trenches is suddenly over. And now the full panoply of Allied tactics, armor and manpower would combine to produce the greatest display of military force the world had ever seen. By mid-October 1918, a sense of doom had spread to the German home front. The Allied naval blockade had cut off most of Germany's food supply. An attack by the Germans and Austrians in northern Italy had driven the Italian army into headlong retreat. After 6 months to regroup, the Italians were ready to counterattack.
La guerra contro l'Austria-Ungheria è sotto l'alta guida di Sua Maestà il Re, Duce Supremo. L'esercito italiano, inferiore per numero e per mezzi, condusse ininterrotta ed asprissima per 41 mesi e vinta. I resti di quello che fu uno dei più potenti eserciti del mondo risalgono in disordine e senza speranza le valli che avevano difeso con orgogliosa sicurezza.
At 5 o'clock on the morning of November the 11th, an armistice was signed on a train in the French forest of Compiègne. At 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns of the Western Front fell silent. Allied troops crossed the German border to occupy the Rhineland. Between 1914 and 1918, some 65 million men took up arms. 10 million died in battle. 20 million were irretrievably wounded in their minds or their bodies. Delegates from Europe's exhausted nations arrived in Paris for the peace conference. The British and French prime ministers, David Lloyd George and George Clemenceau, and America's President Wilson would decide Europe's future. On June the 28th, the peace treaty was signed in the Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles. The conquering nations held their victory parades. and life could begin to return to normal. Already humiliated by its neighbors, it seemed now that Germany would destroy itself from within. The cry went out for a strong new leader. Ludendorff, the man who'd so nearly won the war for Germany, but ended up leading it to defeat, found his answer in the form of a young Austrian corporal, Adolf Hitler. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it was the first act in a European cataclysm that would flare up again in just 2 decades.